Well, I want to thank everybody for coming this morning, I guess early afternoon. And for those of you who are on the internet, welcome, whatever time of day it is for you. This is a discussion and seminar on the circular economy for sustainable development. I think it could not be better timed. In the last couple of years, there's been a renewed focus on the whole area of the bioeconomy, ranging from bioenergy to the whole question of plastics and plastic pollution, on the whole area of circular economy, and the whole climate, and what is biofuels' contribution going to be to the climate problem? If you look at biofuels as a potential aviation fuel, as a fuel for passenger vehicles, as a fuel for trucks, there are an enormous number of studies and a lot of work being going on in this particular area. And part of it is because there are such huge problems. One of the things we cannot increase is the amount of land in the world. And so how we're going to handle the competition for the use of that land when we're going to add approximately 2 billion people over the next 30 years is going to be not only a large issue, it's going to grow. It's going to become bigger and bigger. This whole tension between land as a source of food or land as a source of energy, I think is not going to go away. We also are facing significant water problems as the world is seeing more and more shortages of water at a time when we actually get more rainfall, but it's just not going to the same place. It's a problem. And the rate of evaporation has also increasing. So areas that we really didn't think about as being water short, like the east and west, the eastern part of South Africa, the eastern part and the southern part of India, are now becoming major sources of droughts, as well as any who read any U.S. paper have noticed that the Colorado River hasn't been doing too well lately. And I would not suggest that you open a shopping center in Las Vegas anytime soon. And finally, the whole issue of waste. This is becoming an increasingly large infrastructure issue as we struggle to find ways to handle waste. Recycling got a lot of emphasis maybe a couple of decades ago, but it's becoming somewhat expensive. A lot of these towns and cities I know around the United States are finding that, with the exception of aluminum, they're not getting enough money back on a lot of their recycled goods. So as I said, this seminar could not be scheduled at a better time. So I'm going to turn it over now to Alexandre Strapasson. Over the past several years, Alexandre has been at the core of the Belfer Center's work on all of these topics. Prior to coming to the Kennedy School, he served in the Brazilian government, particularly as the lead official in the agriculture department for work on biofuels at a time, by the way, that Brazil had the largest and most successful biofuel program. I don't know if that you're the cause of this, but thank you. And he came back here 7 years ago for a stint as as a fellow, and he worked at the time, I think I'm going to get this right, on the impact of an expansion of biofuel use in Europe, and where would Europe get that biofuels. The idea is that Europe would, the sort of consensus at the time was that Europe would simply increase their agricultural products and then produce biofuels, but Alexandre found that was not the case, that in reality that they would import it from other places because it was cheaper to develop them in other places than it would be in Europe. He came back 2 years ago, where he has led a lot of our work on the tensions between water, land, and biofuel development. And recently, he's done some very interesting work on biofuel energy and carbon capture and ethanol production, or ethanol, mixing the two together as a source of fuel for power. We've been very, very fortunate to have this relationship with Alexandre, and I want to also thank you for today's seminar, for setting this up. So let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Henry, for this very kind introduction. And it's my honor to be here and to have you as my mentor here at Americans. So welcome everybody here attending in person this seminar, and welcome everyone attending online. I don't know the number of attendees that we have online, but maybe somewhere about 200 people or so. It's a great pleasure to have this event as part of the SDG Series, a series of events on sustainable development goals that we started in 2017. Some colleagues and I, including Marinella David, who is here with us, we started this SDG series of events, and I'm glad to see this series of events back here with two great speakers who are going to talk on the circular economy for sustainable development, the role of land, fuels, and manufacturing. So we are going to have two presentations and a Q&A session at the very end. So for those attending online, you don't have to wait until the end. So please feel free to put in the Q&A, click on the Q&A button and include your question there. And then we're going to have first this presentation, then second speakers, and then Q&A both here in person. So I also would like to introduce my colleagues who are also involved in the organization of this seminar. Elizabeth Hanlon, who is here with us in person, helping with the organization. Elizabeth is the communications and outreach coordinator here at the Belfer Center. We also have online Amanda Sardonis, my colleague Amanda, who is the Associate Director at the Environment and Natural Resources Program here at the Belfer Center, and Henry Lee is the Director of this program here at Belfer. So Amanda is going to moderate the online session. So let me first introduce you the Henrique Pacini, my colleague Henrique. I think Henrique we met long ago in London. Probably, I think it was in London about 10 years ago or so. Yeah, at that time I was finishing doing my PhD. We were also doing our PhD in Sweden. And then we worked together in an article about innovation, biofuels, this type of thing. And I'm very happy to have you in person here at Harvard. So Henrique is an economist at the United Nations conference on trade and development, UNCTAD, in Geneva, where he works on trade and circular economy issues. He has a PhD in energy technology from KTH in Sweden. He recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship here at Harvard University. So Henrique already stayed with us here at Harvard, although I think it was in a Waterhead Center, right? Wonderful. So at Harvard, Henrique examined the commercial dynamics of secondary and scrap materials in world trade, and he chaired Harvard's first circular economy symposium, also here at Harvard. He's also part of the steering committee and implementation team of the Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution Program, SMEP program at UNCTAD, which develops scientific evidence and funds pollution mitigation projects with circular characteristics in Africa and South Asia. Dr. Pacini published several publications on environment, energy, trade, and development issues. So Henrique is over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandre. And thank you, colleagues at the Belfer Center, Lee, Amanda, and all organizers who kindly invited us here. Me and Francis, who's also a good friend and research partner since in Sweden. I'm especially thankful to the Belfer Center for also believing and supporting the first Harvard Circular Economy Symposium, which I had the pleasure to be part of back in 2019, which many other students carry on the torch nowadays, some of which in this room. So the presentation today will be structured in more of a material side and an energy side of the issue. I try to make it as concrete as possible, linking it to an important program we have in the UN, sponsored by the UK, which tries to apply those manufacturing sustainability principles in practice in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. If you allow me, I'll start my presentation here. Just as a side note, when we were developing the first sustainability circular economy symposium here in Harvard, which took place at the Rockefeller Center, having a hybrid meeting was a very complex logistical endeavor. And nowadays it seems simple, right? All the connections are done. There's no large additional costs, and it wasn't like that in 2019. I think we made a lot of progress in being able to include a broader audience. People who are not in Cambridge right now aren't easily connecting to such events. And I think that's a big jump that we do also in the direction of sustainability. I'll be talking about materials and pollution pathways. Of course, there'll be some bias to the issue of plastics. Plastics have gained a lot of traction lately on the UN, the World Trade Organization, and in many other fora, the World Economic Forum, various other organizations and intellectual processes, because plastics is perhaps one icon of a problematic thing we got into for convenience, due to innovation, and now we have to revert back some of this problem into a more sustainable pathway. So in a nutshell, I'll talk a bit about plastics. I'll talk a little bit about manufacturing pollution anchored in the project we have, the intervention approach on how to promote change in practice, and more in the realms of practitioners now than academics, and some reflections which perhaps can be potentially useful for some of you who are doing research on those themes. So everybody knows that the problems of plastics. The oceans are a thermometer of the plastics problem. You have a lot of tonnage of plastic materials slipping into the oceans every year. A lot of the plastics produced on land and the ocean, and it's a cumulative material. You also have problems of plastics in the food web, affecting biodiversity, potentially affecting human health. And additionally, you have the problem of plastics in coastal communities, affecting tourism and various types of activities such as fishing and populations that require a clean environment to thrive and to have their livelihoods. In terms of numbers, the plastics trade is a good thermometer of the plastics production in the world. When I was here at the Weatherhead Center a while ago, I was looking at plastic waste trade, so scrap plastics trade. We did not have those figures yet, which my colleagues at UNCTAD produced. Total trade of plastics is $1 trillion a year. Most of this material is embedded in other products. So it's not plastics polymers per se, but it's a phone case, a piece of a car, or polymer in various types of complexity forms. It's a very large volume of trade. The type of trade I was working with, which ended up in sustainable consumption and production, was just a very small fraction of it. Many of you know that the plastic scrap trade triggered a whole process of environmental governance, starting in 2016 with China issuing some guidance for restrictions on imports of plastic waste, and that those restrictions propagated to other countries as well. So we were talking about, in 2018, less than $4 billion mark of plastic scrap out of a total of $1 trillion in plastics trade. So the size of the problem is very big, and plastic scrap, which is some clusterization of where it flows in the world, is just a small piece of the story. What message that gives? The trade equation, so the trade problem of plastic being flowing around between the countries is just a small subset of the bigger problem. Plastics has to be dealt with at the national level as well. Right? Yes.
Sir, what is the definition of plastic scrap?
Oh yeah, it's trimmings, pieces of everything that is used plastics. Usually they are compacted into pallets and shipped for processing elsewhere. Used to go a lot to China, then to Malaysia, Indonesia, and now there are very few open doors to plastic scrap to be reprocessed elsewhere due to the issue of outsourcing of pollution. But again, plastics need to be dealt with nationally. And this year, there was a very important development. The UN Environment Assembly adopted a resolution calling for a treaty to regulate plastics production and consumption by 2024. This month of May 2022 will be the first month where there will be actually the first meeting of this road to 2024. There will be a meeting in Dakar where governments and experts will gather in Senegal to discuss to start negotiations on what this treaty would look like. In a way, there could be some similarities of what the UN Treaty on Plastics could do to a process, for example, of how legislation is done at the EU. A UN treaty can, if adopted by enough countries, can be applicable to adjust national laws, and that can help to harmonize national policies to deal with plastics, together with the efforts at the trade level. So this is why this is a very, it's a very short timeline, but a very encouraging development that we are now having an intergovernmental process, a global one, to develop a treaty on this type of material. So there are a bunch of things established, like a negotiation committee, a science policy panel to advise the governments in this process, and also many approaches will be used. Of course, to use less plastics, use alternatives to plastics, so biodegradable plastics, or plastics made out of biomaterials or biomass. Like Francis will probably talk a lot about land use. Some of those approaches can increase demand for land for producing feedstocks for bioplastics. Also, there is the question of substitutes. What other materials can you use instead of plastics? Ceramics, metals, natural fibers, post-harvest agricultural waste, marine materials like algae. The spectrum of solutions is very large. So we have the issue of the low value of these materials. So when you have a very low value in a material, it's hard, it doesn't circle back into the economic space and accumulates in nature. And to make the problem worse, as many of you know, many countries in the world don't have plastics management system in place or recycling structures in place. So one of the things we often examine and talk about, especially in the context of development, is to really shift some of the function performed by plastics to other materials, which are more environmentally friendly, compostable, or made out of natural products. Of all that big scope of plastics, that is $1 trillion trade per year, you have one specific subset of plastics that are very complicated. The SUPs, as we call it, single-use plastics. So the sachets, the plastic cups, bottles, bags, the things that are actually found in shores and coastal areas, they are an indicator of the really problematic areas in the world. And of course, you can use alternative materials to perform the same function as a single-use plastic. For example, a cotton bag, a jute bag, or an algae-based mulch fuel, which would help to develop new industrial capacities, new productive capacities in developing countries. That is getting a bit more precise here. How do we actually try to work out the problem in a more practical way? I was talking about the virtues of circularity or importance of waste management systems. We all know that. In trade, every product that is traded, most products that are traded, have a specific code attached to them, like an HS code, part of the harmonized system. We can look at codes that can be attributed to different substitute materials, feedstocks. For example, aluminum has a code, glass has another code, coconut husks have a code. Paper, cardboard, jute, sisal, some waste material like wheat husks, banana leaves, they have codes in the international, in the nomenclature that is used by customs authorities around the world to track the flow of trade. Fine. You have the same for products. So talking about feedstocks first, talking about end-use products. So you have codes that can be attributed to containers. Containers made out of alternative material, different materials. Can be there codes that are attached to straws or bags, paper bags or jute bags. And those codes are the ones that you use to put your import tariffs up and down. So this is, for example, one precise way to facilitate trade or to lower the cost of accessing plastic substitutes in various countries, if the country decide to play around with their import tariffs. This table just came at 2 a.m. today for me, which shows one interesting thing. If you look at the lower right part of this table, you see that the average import tariffs, only for a set of countries here, this is just a sample, Brazil, the average of Brazil, China, and USA's import tariffs, you see that for things that are considered to be more sustainable than plastics, for example, aluminum, glass, paper, jute, and the import tariffs are even higher than for plastics themselves. Of course, there are a number of reasons for that, especially to protect basic industries and similar arguments, but that's something the world will have to look at, have to perhaps facilitate trade of things that are considered to be better or have a better downstream nature or better downstream management. Vis-a-vis plastics, you cannot really keep the flow of harmful materials very cheap, very easy, very liberalized, while we make it difficult for potentially more sustainable substitutes to be traded, to be imported in various countries. We're trying to gather this data to help countries at the WTO understand the problem and identify areas where they can actually help to reduce the cost of substitutes. This is very readable. Sorry, perhaps for the colleagues online. This is a snapshot of one study we did because, okay, talking about cotton bags or aluminium or clay as being more sustainable than plastics is just a narrative. Could be wrong, right? So you need to attach those materials to another type of analysis, which is life cycle analysis. This shows this. It's a fact sheet for a part of a fact sheet for Kenya, which shows for different types of materials, like a paper bag, a jute bag, a cotton bag, or a wool bag, what type of environmental impacts it has according to a standardized life cycle analysis database. So we did some analysis here. For example, cotton. Cotton seemed to be very negative if you use it, of course, if you use the bag only once, because it has a very large footprint on its production and also on land it's used to produce it. Paper has a lower footprint, but still there is one. And of course, for any direction we go, if we take the road that was not taken, so if we reduce the use of plastics and increase the usage of, for example, glass for some of its function, for example, to deliver liquids, you of course have to look at the downstream of each country adopted that solution. So can you handle glass better than you handle plastics today? So it's quite a challenging mission because it involves countries deciding on policies and also the municipalities they having developing capacities and plans to deal with this new material reality. If any of you are interested to see those fact sheets, they are part of the SMEP program, the Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution Program, which is look at manufacturing pollution and also plastics. But we have a lot of data for countries. So this part of the intervention approach as well. Have to write the talk. So instead of only working at the multilateral level, trade codes, advice, life cycle analysis, and data, the SMEP program also funds projects, and there are 9 projects ongoing now in various areas. Some of them are, of course, focused on connecting the downstream to the upstream, like making construction materials out of plastics, that the upper right picture there. There are some very sensitive areas which we're also trying to fund work on, like mulch films, something we don't see in cities, but most agriculture produce is actually protected by plastics in the field, and also the mulch films used to protect vegetables produced in supermarkets. That is hard to transmaterialize to other products. So we're trying to look at alternatives to that, and also fishing nets. The Arctic Initiative here in HKS has worked on initial fishing nets, a special type of pollutant that are very difficult to get away from, perhaps with more aquaculture, so getting out of natural water bodies and doing fishing more from artificial tanks. But we're trying to look at biodegradable fishing nets by funding one project in that area. Shifting a bit to the issue of pollution, what does this Sankey diagram says? There are different types of economic sectors. This is a mapping for East Africa done by Open Capital Advisors, which will help to frame into a diagram. On the left side, you have different economic sectors, the high export relevance, food and beverage, basic metals, chemical products, pulp, paper, textiles. The middle of this graph shows the types of pollutants that are associated with those sectors. And then you have a large number of potential solutions. They're hard to read, but for example, they involve biodigestion, they involve dust collectors, they involve water treatment systems. A lot of things that help in practice for you to apply circularity. And those things are made of goods and services. Sometimes those filters, recycling services, or biotreatment solutions are not available in specific countries. We did a bigger analysis on this, and many of them are not available domestically to those countries. So you need trade facilitation also on the goods and services realm to make sure that the solutions flow and are adopted by production sites everywhere. As you know, and this was done for East Africa with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement advancing. You have countries growing fast and developing productive capacity. You don't want those capacities to grow in a polluting manner. You want the circularity aspect to be there. So we will launch a research funding call later this year, around July, to fund 9 million British pounds of solutions and projects. If some of you are interested to apply, you're most welcome. We're also doing some data provision work, so coupling the trade data, because anything we buy creates a shadow of pollution from the production side onwards, or even from the field, from the inputs to production upstream. And we are creating a dashboard on linking exports and LCA, so life cycle analysis data, for us to have a better idea of what is the pollution footprint of exports from some countries, or 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and 3 countries in South Asia. For example, the textile sector, tannery sector would be included. This is a data production effort. We're going to have, we're actually happy to say that we cooperate with SCI in also defining the problem. We as UN will mostly work in the South. And this project is going to be launched and cover those 4 key sectors. Of course, we have to pick our battles, and the procurement will cover pollution mitigation and circularity, and tanneries, textiles, food processing, and lead acid batteries. Why lead acid batteries? Imagine that many of us here are from developing countries. I am. And in electric mobility in the South, you might have a lot of still usage of very dirty and polluting lead acid batteries in rickshaws and other materials. And it's a very complicated problem in terms of environmental pollution, leakage of material, and child labor. And we are probably going to do something in the sector as well. I'll not bore you with our publications. We just have a bunch of links. This presentation can be made available to all of you. It explains a bit the plastics trade, manufacturing, pollution, and trade connections with more detail. Finally, just closing here, Francis, I'm sorry if I'm getting into your time, but I think it's going to be very synergic. Some reflections of what I see happening. Perhaps that can touch also the energy material nexus. After COVID and the Ukrainian war, now there's a preoccupation for reshoring manufacturing capacities. Carrying here one face mask that was made by my mom as part of an initiative in my hometown of Ribeirão Preto in Brazil, where 70,000 face masks were made to cater for personal protection requirements of a lot of people in my hometown who could not afford disposable mask back in 2020. And that showed that community had to mobilize to produce some type of protection, given that the supply chains were not delivering masks, or the world capacity to produce facial masks was not enough in 2020. And the same happened for medicine, for a lot of electronic supplies, and in many other sectors. So there's this preoccupation of reshoring manufacturing capacity. And with this reshoring, there will be pollution consequences. There's also the urgency of energy security. In Switzerland now, houses will be mandated to have geothermal heating very soon. That gas prices have shot up recently all over Europe, also variety. So these issues will create more competition for land. There will be a push for renewables, alternative solutions, and running the world on renewable materials and energy and mitigating pollution at the same time require a lot of adjustments in society. You see inflation everywhere. The former head of UNEP, Henrique, used to say that change will come by design or by default. Perhaps inflation is one of the signs of an adjustment, costs going up towards sustainability. And we cannot just do things business as usual, because if we encroach more on biodiversity and ecosystems, we suffer further blowbacks. What makes me especially preoccupied is, okay, you endured COVID quite well. I think society today is far richer than it used to be 150 years ago. And in a way, we're facing cost increases. We face a lot of restrictions, but we still manage to keep the essential things: communications, shelter, nutrition. But a lot of people do not have this privilege. A lot of people live on the edge. Their income is just enough for them to cater their needs. And if we have some cost increases across the board, that towards sustainability, more renewables, materials and energy, and you don't really change the structure of society in terms of income inequality, you might have a lot of people falling under a certain threshold where social stability is at stake. So this is a call for reflection. We need to really redesign systems that are more thoughtful, perhaps recover a lot of lessons from the past, or previous society models that were very functional, sacrifice a little bit of our convenience, but get back on track, because potentially we get to a slightly more costly world, and a lot of people in the world cannot really afford it today. I'll end here. Well, thank you for this, your attention, and I'm looking forward to Francis' presentations. Thanks, Alexandre.
Thank you very much. Really great presentation. It was fascinating. I was wondering about many issues here. I'll have some questions here for you, but to keep them to the very end. There probably the colleagues will also ask you some questions, and feel free, the colleagues here after the presentations to ask your questions. I was also wondering about not only how to recycle materials, but also how to encourage more how to reduce and how to reuse all these materials in order to avoid the need to recycle larger and larger amounts of waste that we have worldwide. So thanks again, Henrique. I will now move straight into our colleague Francis Johnson. Francis, let's see if Francis is already with the slide. I think you have to stop sharing your. Oh, there it is. There it is. It is already Francis' presentation there. So welcome, Francis. It's really great to have you here. I will just make a brief introduction about Francis. And Francis and I, we worked together in a publication long ago. Francis led a book on bioenergy in Africa. I had the chance to write one of these chapters at that time, and Francis is one of the world references in bioeconomy and land use and biofuels. So it's a great honor for us, Francis, to have you here with us in this seminar. So Francis is a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and is currently based at SEI Asia Center in Bangkok as policy and climate cluster leader. Francis holds a master's degree in public policy and operations research and a PhD degree in energy and climate systems. He has more than 25 years of experience in social, economic, and environmental policy analysis on climate mitigation, biofuels, bioeconomy, and sustainable land use. Francis served as a lead author of the IPCC AR6 special report on climate change and land, and is a member of the writing team for the forthcoming IPCC AR6 synthesis report. So Francis is gonna talk on governing land and biomass use for a climate compatible bioeconomy. So thank you very much, Francis, and it's over to you now.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Alexandre and Henrique and colleagues there. I would have liked to be with you in person, but COVID had other ideas and I could not travel this week to the US, unfortunately. So my talk today will be, I think, a bit more broad and maybe not as practical as Henrique's, but I hope to give you an idea of some of these relationships between how we use land and biomass and how we can look in the future towards a climate compatible or a climate resilient bioeconomy. So I'd like to mention first my organization, the Stockholm Environment Institute, because it happens to be the 50th anniversary of the UN Conference on the Human Environment. And this came to be known as the Stockholm Conference, and that's where my institute takes its name. And you might be interested in this Stockholm Plus 50 events that are coming up on the 2nd and 3rd of June, actually. And our institute has these 8 offices around the world, as shown in the picture. It's also particularly interesting this year of Stockholm Plus 50 because circularity and bioeconomy were really emerging as key ideas already 50 years ago. And they're actually quite critical even to the whole concept of sustainable development that came later. So it's an interesting historical connection that we talk about today. So yeah, I like this historical context. So I don't mean to take you back 200 years in history, but I think just to bring in the energy side of this equation, as Henrique alluded to earlier, it's interesting to note that we had this big shift a little more than 100 years ago as the world was moving away from dependence on biomass and towards fossil fuels. And so here you see this quite significant shift around the turn of the last century as these other sources came into use. And it's only much later that nuclear came, of course. So we had this development of oil, gas, and coal. And this high dependence continues to this day, as you can see, in spite of the penetration of renewables. You can see that fossil fuels have really barely ticked down during the last decades. So it's this historical development is kind of significant as we look towards the future. It's not going to be that easy as we might think. And maybe we have the technology, but there are a lot of other issues. And that's what I want to talk about today, is these issues related to land and particularly biomass and how this relates to our climate and development challenges. And finally, at the bottom there, just to note that the changes over time really proceeded a bit differently across these different sectors, in that energy use in residential and services came quite a bit later than the others. So this end use perspective on energy is also important. But I want to move and not talk too much about energy and talk more about bioeconomy and climate compatible development pathways within or related to the bioeconomy. And so here I talk about these three stages, you might say, the natural economy, which 200 years ago, this heavy reliance on biomass all around the world might be referred to as the natural economy. And we had this jump 100 years later towards the fossil economy. And now we're interested in the bioeconomy. And it's something different than either of these. That it is renewable, it is maybe, let's say, high tech or at least medium tech. And the land's intensiveness is also different. In the natural economy, natural economy is actually quite land intensive. As you might know, the use of traditional biomass and low agricultural productivity ends up using a lot of land with very little return. The fossil economy is not land intensive, but of course it's responsible for climate change and many other negative impacts. And then we have the bioeconomy, which will be moderately land intensive, in fact, if we do it well. If we do it badly, it will be very land intensive. So that's something we can talk about. And then we have this issue, can developing countries leapfrog from the natural economy to the bioeconomy? So just to give you a definition, this definition is taken from the Global Bioeconomy Summit that's held every few years. The bioeconomy is production, utilization, and conservation of biological resources, including knowledge, science, technology, innovation, to provide information, products, processes, and services across all economic sectors aiming towards sustainability. So it's a very broad definition, and it's important to realize that it includes conservation as well, that it's not just about production and consumption. It's a different type of economy, and it recognizes the long-term nature of these changes that need to be made. And going along with that, there are really these core principles, which when we talk about bioeconomy, we like to talk about adding value. And here it can be economic value, but it can also be social value or well-being, which I think I alluded to in the beginning on that very first graph, that what we're looking for is greater well-being, not just greater economic product. And then also this idea of innovation, doing things differently. It can be technological innovation. It can also be innovation in the choice of applications or in the management or in the end use. And then we have this idea of cross-cutting, that the bioeconomy cuts across the sectors. So when we talk about this core of the bioeconomy, we're not talking about, for example, increasing agricultural productivity or really good forest management. These things are all important and should be done for their own purposes within those sectors. But in the bioeconomy, we're working across sectors, and we're advancing new processes, new products, new ideas, and new innovation platforms. So this is what you might say the core of the bioeconomy. And what does that mean in practical terms when we talk about adding value and cross-cutting? Well, this is just a simple depiction about what some people might think of as high tech or mid tech or low tech. And in this presentation, you may have noticed, I'm not going to put a big focus on technology, because what we're really talking about is how we use land and how we use biomass. Nevertheless, technology is always there and is quite important, of course. And if you look at high tech, you see things like genome editing or synthetic biology, which might be of great interest, let's say, in the US and in Europe, but maybe of less interest in the global South, just because of the comparative advantage there. And if you look in the mid-tech area, you find applications and approaches that might have broader appeal. For example, agroforestry. different types of new bio-based products, advanced biofuels. And then if we look down at low tech, that's what we would like to move away from because it's a very low productivity. It's neither cross-cutting nor value adding, such as traditional biomass use, which today is still around half of all biomass use that's used for energy is still in traditional forms. And this is a major problem for climate, for health, and for other SDGs as well. So just putting it into pictures then, the idea is to move the factory into the fields, to do with biology what we previously did with thermochemistry and various applications that involve a lot of non-renewable processes. So we want to move towards a renewable economy, and that is the future of the bioeconomy. Renewable and sustainable are a bit different, of course, and there are certain types of bio-based systems which are less sustainable than others. And there's many areas of work, of course, related to trying to figure that out. Henrique alluded to life cycle analysis, which is also very important in comparing different bioeconomy systems or different biofuels or biorefineries, let's say. So just adding in the social side of the bioeconomy, this depiction, I think, which came from IUCN, just tries to put in perspective the circular bioeconomy, because it's not enough to just produce and consume bio-based products and use bio-based processes. The circularity has to be achieved as well. So reduce, maintain, reuse, recycle. These principles are important in a bio-based economy, in a sustainable bioeconomy. And just to give a practical example of this, let's say, for example, replacing concrete and steel buildings with wooden buildings that are very long-lived. Not only have we replaced fossil fuels in the manufacture of concrete and steel, but at the end of life of those buildings, it can be used again for as a fuel. So there are a lot of examples like this where the circularity principles combine with bioeconomy principles and climate compatibility as well. So when we work with, one of the things we do at my institute is we work a lot with stakeholders to understand their perspectives and bring this in so that rather than working on technology per se, we're interested in the implementation and the governance of technology and systems, and in this case, particularly how land and biomass are used. So we have these visions, these three visions of the bioeconomy. Some interesting research done some years ago showed that it really actually breaks out pretty well. There's biotechnology vision, bioresource, and bioecology. And we've done some work with a lot of stakeholders and found that actually the stakeholders do tend to, one of these views tends to dominate actually. And the other views might be there as well, but one tends to dominate. And of course, today I'm particularly focusing on the resources and the ecology visions. So I want to mention that this, when we talk about the transformative power of the bioeconomy, we're also talking about the fact that landscapes will be transformed as well. Physical landscapes are going to change in the coming decade if we want to achieve climate goals and development goals. And this involves various types of integration. It can be integration of trees into agricultural landscapes, which is agroforestry. It can be integration of different crops, or it can be integration across different seasons, which is already done in Brazil and the US and a number of countries to take better advantage of different climates and soils and the needs of different crops over the growing seasons, and thereby increasing the productivity of land. I think as Henry Lee said in the beginning, You know, you can't make more land. So the principle is that you have to do a better job of managing it. And that's really critical here, managing land and biomass better and better over time. So I thought I'd give a slide that had some good news, actually, moving into the climate part of this discussion. And that is that trees and on agricultural land, which is mainly agroforestry, during this particular decade, 2000 to 2010, there was a decent increase in a number of world regions amounting to about 0.7 gigatons of CO2 per year. It's not an enormous amount in terms of where we need to get to for CO2 savings in the coming decades, but it is a quite good contribution. And so there are these opportunities for agroforestry and other types of sequestration that can make a significant contribution, and that's shown by the blue shaded areas, which particularly in Latin America, but also in some parts of Asia and Africa as well, and Europe, even the US as well. So I wanted to come back to some first principles in talking about carbon, just to give a sense of the particular challenge here. And the challenge is that we have the land systems and we have the ocean systems. And if you look at how carbon is stored, a lot of carbon is stored in the oceans, in the deep ocean. Here you see the largest portion. Fossil carbon is also a significant amount. So then we have this share of carbon that is in flux between standing biomass and soils and the atmosphere. And here's what we have to work with then on the left-hand side, the land-based systems. So getting more carbon into soils, getting more carbon into standing biomass, and then getting more carbon recycled in the system by using bioenergy and bio-based products in a sustainable way. So I like to put this issue of carbon removal into the overall context of negative emissions, because there are other ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere than just through land-based systems. So sorry for the small text, but the boxed areas in red are some land-based systems that we happen to be focusing on in a current project. But then if you look at the overall portfolio of negative emission technologies, you have a number of industrial approaches, such as direct air capture and storage. And then you have all the ocean management practices, which have their own particular dynamics and impacts. And so these implications of all of these are very different, even though they serve the same purpose of getting carbon out of the atmosphere. So looking then at some of these different land-based systems, we have also the situation that land and climate feed back to each other. So there are certain tipping points, certain feedback effects as land is more exposed to climate impacts. And actually, many people might not be aware that when we talk about average temperatures going up 1 degree or 1.5 degrees, that's the temperature over land and water averaged together. The average temperature over land is has already surpassed 1.5 degrees actually. And what this means is that there are not a lot of potentially negative impacts in terms of land degradation and other ecological impact. And these are quite different across the different land systems. And these were explored in some detail in the IPCC special report that came out 2.5 years ago. And just to mention a few results from that report that are relevant, you have, in fact, this very large amount of land, the green shaded in the middle, which is the largest, and that's pastures. And so it's likely in the future that as we use land for uses other than food, chances are good it's going to concentrate on these pasture areas, because forests have a lot of other purposes. They tend to preserve more biodiversity, and they tend to be needed for other uses. So, and then we have a number of areas that are not suitable for either agriculture or forestry. And then we have the heavily used areas for agriculture, including irrigated areas. And then with regard to forests, the chances are pretty good that an increasing amount of forests are going to be managed forests. And this is not necessarily negative, because managed forests, if they're managed well, can host significant amount of biodiversity. Nevertheless, we want at all costs to prevent further deforestation, particularly in sensitive areas. So this, of course, is a serious issue. So just to mention some more examples, we have in agriculture, of course, a lot of annual crops, but these don't necessarily accumulate very much soil carbon. With perennial crops, we can sequester a lot more carbon, and the roots go deeper. And so perennial grasses like miscanthus and switchgrass are already being used in the US, in Europe, and in China, and a number of other countries, to see how we can transform landscapes in a way that's positive both for climate, but also for ecological, for ecosystem services as well. So to give another example of this integration of bioeconomy and climate in terms of these cross-cutting systems, biochar is another interesting example. Biochar is a way to add soil amendments which improve the stability of the soil, but more importantly, it's the soil's ability to sequester carbon. And often, if done well, the persistence of carbon sequestration in biochar systems can be 100 years or more, which by climate standards is a good persistence. And the other aspect I wanted to emphasize here is this cross-cutting aspect, that when it's implemented well, we have this integration across multiple systems: agriculture, livestock, energy, forests, possibly in the form of agroforestry. Integrating these systems well connects to the circularity arguments that we were talking about earlier. So, sorry to hit you with this rather dense graph, but this was an interesting result that came out of the IPCC land report. And that is that there are many different future scenarios. Some of you are familiar with the SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways for under which different climate scenarios are investigated. And one of the results, which was interesting, showed that in those scenarios that were very resource intensive, the requirements for land-based mitigation, and especially bioenergy, are even greater, because there are very few choices left at that stage. So it's a reminder of two things: that it's very important to cut emissions in all sectors, but it's also a reminder that the how we use land and biomass is going to get more and more important in the coming decades, because we don't know what scenario is going to play out. And these shading show the amount of land that might be transformed by 2100. It's quite a significant amount of land in some cases, 7.5 million kilometers squared, actually, which is quite significant. So again, sorry for the busy slide, but here I wanted to mention what I like to call the big five of land mitigation. bioenergy, BECCS, reforestation, afforestation, and biochar. These can achieve really big savings or really big carbon sequestration. But the issue here actually, and I think this connects to the theme of your seminar series, is how do you get co-benefits and synergies with other SDGs? Because if they are implemented badly, they can have some negative impacts, and that's shown by the red or pink in some cases in these graphs. These are negative impacts for land use, such as land degradation or difficulties with adaptation or food security. But if implemented well with best practice and good governance, then we can not only get these high savings in terms of carbon or high carbon sequestration, but we can get good synergies and co-benefits with other land-based SDGs and even some of the other SDGs as well. So now I want to wrap up and say what are some key issues here when we connect land and biomass use to climate aims and SDGs. So first, I'd like to say that using land and biomass sustainably is the long game. It's something that's going to take time, but is extremely important because even if emissions are reduced significantly in other sectors in the near term, we still need this learning and investment in the near term to start moving to best practice to reduce land use pressures and avoid in the future overshooting the climate targets, which will also deepen poverty and inequality. So that's number one. Number two, we can also think of land mitigation as an insurance policy, because if emissions are not reduced significantly enough or fast enough, then the land mitigation becomes even more important. And that's the result of some of the analysis with the integrated assessment models and other studies. And we have this issue of long residence time of CO2, so it takes decades. And then finally, land is where people live. So some of these other measures that happen in oceans or industrial measures, they're less likely to have the co-benefits or the synergies, particularly in rural areas where we can have benefits for ecosystem health, biodiversity, food security. And this is really a difference from the industrial measures or the ocean measures where people, it doesn't affect where people live, and it's less likely to support poverty reduction. And you have this possibility of people contributing actively to this transition and this transformation. Okay, that's it. And these are a couple of the projects that have supported some of the studies that are behind this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Francis. This was a really great presentation, full of insights and lots of complex topics that we could discuss here for weeks, actually, about each topic that you presented here, how to increase soil carbon and to promote circular bioeconomy, as you mentioned. So very, very interesting presentation. Thank you so much, Francis. So what I'm going to do now, so I will open for a few questions here from colleagues in person. Then I will pass to our colleague Amanda Sardonis, who is going to select some questions made online, posted online. So then we could have these questions from here and there till the end of this event. So do you have any questions here, Professor?
We've given this time, we ought to start open this up.
Great. Any colleagues, any question here? Just the first one? Yeah, there's a colleague.
Francis? Hello? This
Yeah.
question's for Francis.
No, he's there. He's there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Francis. My name's Matt Rolling, and I'm a mid-career master MBA student here at the Kennedy School. One of the areas that I've been interested in is sustainable aviation fuels. And I know you modeled out a couple different scenarios for land use, but obviously between water and land demand, these are really controversial. Just curious if you've ever done any digging, is it unrealistic to expect that the commercial aviation industry can use biofuels to displace petroleum, or just kind of curious to get your thoughts on biofuels in the aviation space?
Sure. Aviation fuels are not my specialty, but from those I know that work on it, I mean, it's clear that this should be a priority. Biofuels for aviation and shipping, and to some extent, and actually also for heavy transport, because these are areas that are harder to electrify compared to vehicles and other applications. So it's clear they should receive a higher priority. How fast they can be replaced is an issue. The costs for biofuels have not come down as fast as other renewables, but I think it's also partly because we're not weighing in these other benefits, these co-benefits and synergies. Our economic system has difficulty when you have multiple products and processes and benefits at the same time, because it tends to be one commodity at a time. So I think that's how I tend to see it, that there is a market there, but it's taking longer for those reasons.
Yeah, one of the things that my understanding is with burning kerosene or diesel, you have some really nasty air particulates that are especially prevalent in low-income communities, at least in the United States. And so my understanding is that biofuels are burn a little bit cleaner, and that you don't have the particulates you get with kerosene and diesel.
That's right.
Great. So we have another question for you guys.
Hi, Francis. My name is Rajan, and I'm an Advanced Leadership Fellow here. You spoke about negative emissions technologies and direct air capture, and that also involves sequestration of carbon underground. So my question is, has any research been done on what could be the long-term effects on geology if we put carbon underground in saline aquifers and in coal seams and other things? Are there any detrimental effects that you envisage?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not quite my specialty. From what I understand from people who work on this, there are some concerns there. But the reason I listed a lot of different options is precisely because there are always going to be these type of impacts, and it may be that BECCS and some of the other storage approaches will face certain constraints, not to mention the social constraints that are already being seen with renewables. And so that's why I tried to emphasize this broad portfolio, that we have to be prepared with many different measures and technologies, and not necessarily put all our eggs in one basket. So that's what I was trying to say.
Great, thank you. We're gonna just pass to some questions online, and then we return here for questions in person as well. Thank you. So Amanda, over to you.
Thank you. We've had a number of questions, specific questions about sort of the life cycle analysis and the post-production impacts of plastic, and a number of these Henrique has been nice enough to address, sort of live typing in the answers to those questions. And so at least for the people online, you can see his answers. But I think these questions go to a broader question about who is responsible for the impacts of materials like plastic, especially post-production. So Henrique, could you say a little more about some of the policies that are either been proposed or in place to mitigate some of those impacts? I'm thinking, in particular, Bill Clark has mentioned the sort of the health impacts of plastic, microplastics. Also, this, like, who is responsible for post-consumer recycling and disposal?
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Clark. I've seen he posted many questions there. The issue of responsibilities is it's a lesson we carry on since the climate debate early days. It's clear it's not a public sector issue anymore, or a city, municipality management issue. it's now plastic negligence. So it can eat out your brand, the company. It can also look bad inside your building, or the UN in New York was very slow. They now don't have that single-use plastic anymore. Everything is being phased out. There's a set of responsibilities of people trying to create rules of the game at the multilateral level and at the national level. There's one problem though. I think there is good will from the public sector, the multilateral and the national level, and the municipalities, but finance is not yet where the discourse is. There's still a lot of public sector money going into virgin plastics production, and also private sector investors going in the same direction. The policies proposed in the UNEA discussions or early discussions involve a set of okay, let's make plastics that are carbon neutral, so bioplastics. Let's make plastics that don't have so much downstream problems like biodegradable plastics, but they are still plastics. They still keep the linear pattern there. And also the third road, let's make less plastics. Let's reuse things more, let's throw back into other models that fulfill the needs without having to go there. And all those policies proposed have their caveats, have their interested groups behind and groups against. And it's going to be a big challenge for the Intergovernmental Committee who's going to start negotiating this month in Dakar. For the health impacts that Professor Biochar asked, I think this is an area of hot debates. I think there's still evidence emerging of detected microplastics in sea life and also in human blood. I think that more compelling evidence of human health impacts would be, in a way, positive for the plastics transformation, or for us to deal with the problem, because then it could be a very personal issue for everybody, like or for carbons or dioxins or pesticides. Some types of pesticides were in the past that triggered very faster action. But I think the issue of health impacts is still a hot research area with no really clear insights, at least not to my knowledge.
Thank you, Henrique. Amanda?
Yes, Francis is rapidly typing answers to the to the question, specific questions that I was going to highlight here. I do want to, for the benefit of the people who are not are in our virtual audience, there's a question from Alicia Harley about the current emphasis on carbon sequestration through conservation agriculture practices. And she asks, what is the scientific consensus on the stability of carbon sequestration in agriculture? And what happens when the land that has previously sequestered carbon is then disturbed? And are those benefits lost? What does this say about the best design of incentives, like subsidies, for farmers to practice agriculture methods that sequester carbon?
Yeah, I think there's a new area, you might call it carbon farming, basically, that is coming, and farmers and other landowners are going to have a crucial role in this. But this issue of persistence, it's already been an issue in other types of climate savings, including, for example, reduced deforestation and so forth. There were already issues with the persistence of those savings. So some similar issues will come in conservation agriculture, in low tillage agriculture, all of the different options there, which affect the amount of carbon going into soils. So this analysis for carbon removals is a relatively new area in some respects. So it's true that this needs to be analyzed, and the value of those removals is going to be assessed on the carbon markets, just like the value of other removals.
Great, thank you, Francis. We have some questions here as well, Amanda. So Alejandro, I think you would like to ask.
Yeah, thank you for both presentations. I'm Alexandre Strapasson, a postdoc fellow at the ENRP. I have one question for Francis and one question for Henrique. For Francis, so we all know we're on a tight timeline to reduce emissions. And I was thinking about how you think about the scale and speed for the bioeconomy. I have done some work on solar PV. So the way I think about scale and speed is repetition and building the same thing in just bigger factories. So it's hard to wrap my head around how the bioeconomy solutions could scale at a sufficient speed to make a significant contribution. And for Henrique, I found very interesting your mentions of different materials for replacing plastics. But somehow the economist in me tells me that if companies are not using them, it's because they've not found cheap enough alternatives that are also more sustainable. So I wanted to ask you if you think about this problem more as an innovation problem that we still need to find that alternative, or you approach it more as, okay, we'll have to deal with higher costs and just figure out changes in other parts of the system to replace plastics. Thank you.
Francis, you want to go first?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think that sorry, I was listening to Enrique's question. Can you remind me again of the
Sure. How do you think about scaling at sufficient speed?
scaling. Yeah, of course. The scaling issue is really completely different. You're absolutely right that the experience we had for solar and wind, and to some extent some other renewables, is not, I don't think it's going to be repeated. I would say it's more like you might call it scaling out rather than scaling up, because the applications are so varied and the conditions are so localized. If you compare to solar or wind, that scaling up is something very different. That being said, of course, when you get into the industrial applications like BECCS or the direct air capture, for example, there are some obvious scaling issues there. So of course, the more technological the solution is, I think the more scaling might be involved, but the more it focuses on the land and biomass side, which is mostly what I've talked about here, then it's more like scaling out, I think.
Yeah. Answering your other question on the whether the materials issue is a matter of innovation or costs, like having to face higher costs. We also looked at that direct comparison between the plastic product and its equivalent substitute, and it's often the case that the substitute is a bit more expensive. Like paper bags tend to be more expensive in country X, Y, and Z than a plastic bag. But I don't think it's an innovation problem. The solutions are there. It's just that we downscale the production size of those things to a point where it's not price competitive with the scale of plastics today. So if we gear public procurement towards rescaling that world of alternatives or substitutes, perhaps the cost can go down, and then we can shift. But there is innovation though in one area that like how we use stuff. Like the classic example is you really need to buy a power screwdriver if my neighbor has one, just because I don't have the information that the neighbor has one and is willing to rent to me for $1. That type of platform, like Biochar and for friends, and yeah, that type of model doesn't exist or is very small. Yeah, that could be massively impactful also for plastics material, lead, lithium polymer utilizations. So, but for the classic thing, single-use plastics example, I don't think it's an innovation problem. I think it's a scale problem.
Thank you. Wonderful. Great. We have here Ryan. Many colleagues actually, but let's start with Ryan, please.
Thanks, Francis and Julie. My question is for Francis. My name is Priyank, and I'm a postdoc at
Belfer Center, I work on hard-to-abate sectors. So in my space, which is heavy-duty freight transportation and shipping and trucking, we are at a inflection point where we don't know which fuel is most likely to be supportive for the sector in the long term. So there is a stream of literature which has been arguing that biofuels are the way to go forward because the carbon intensities have come down over the last couple of decades. Whereas there's this other group of researchers and literature which says that biofuels would end up using more, might cause land intensive changes. On the renewable fuel side, green hydrogen, green ammonia are not there at a point where you can deploy them at scale given what's the price of available fossil fuels. So in this uncertain environment, what would you recommend to a policymaker that they do in terms of developing a feasible path forward for the hard to build?
Actually, the best path is usually to reduce demand, because then you address multiple issues at the same time. But if you want to work only on the supply side, the historical experience suggests it's true that a winner tends to eventually emerge, but it seems important to invest in a few different pathways. And in the case of let's say in the case of shipping, again, shipping is not my specialty, although I have a colleague that works on shipping. And here I think that there probably are going to be a few different solutions emerging in the medium term. And considering the relatively high emissions of shipping compared to other modes of transport, it seems like the incentives are a little bit better for biofuels in some cases there. Again, it's not my specialty, so I wouldn't venture to give recommendations though.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm glad to see my colleague Semida Silveira also online here with us. It's really great to have you together with us, Semida. Amanda, do you have other questions online?
Yes, I was hoping that both Francis and Henrique could address Samida's question, again, for the benefit of the people who are in the room together, which is, you talked a lot about the challenges to create circularity in our economy, at both the local and global level, and maybe this is a nice question also to wrap up on. What do you see are the low-hanging fruit or specific areas that provide entry points for system transformation toward enhanced circularity? And what are you really excited about?
Go ahead, Henrique.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks, Amanda. It's a pleasure to receive a question from you. She's a professor at Cornell University and former PhD advisor. I think that the low-hanging fruits to teach people who can give scale to the right markets the knowledge to apply that. I think those working with public procurement officials, also private procurement companies are already doing that, to put their money in where it's better. So to think about the purchase that you do. School meals, have 1 day a week vegetarian protein instead of meat, transmaterialize your cups, bring back water fountains. This type of educational push, like the bottom up, which can be done at the municipal level as well. Some examples can be given by government authorities to change their geographic space, their buildings, into areas where there's no single-use plastics, for example. That's a low-hanging fruit. I think we've seen a lot of transformation on that. And I hope that also the countries can agree on a set of standard approaches for national policies, economic instruments, by 2024. That'll be a massive blueprint for plastics that can be translated to other material problems in the future as well.
I think that the issue of diets can no longer be avoided when it comes to climate impacts and land use impacts. Somewhere around half of all biomass that's extracted gets used for animal feed. It's an astounding figure, and this is not really going to be sustainable. So addressing this demand side, I think in terms of diets, in terms of energy efficiency, it's the low hanging fruit, although it always seems to have behavioral barriers. And then on the supply side, I think the Brazilian example of bioethanol remains one of the best when it comes to combining transport solution with high efficiency agriculture and actually other bio-based products and services, electricity, in some cases bioplastics. So you have a lot of good examples. Another low-hanging fruit, I think, is usually reforestation, just because of the significant value for carbon sequestration. So there are a lot of things we can do at low or negative cost, but eventually there will be the cost will increase, of course. So.
Great, excellent. I have another question for our colleague here. Do you still want to share?
Yes. And this is for Henry. Henry, you spoke about plastics recycling. When we talk to people who actually recycle plastic, they say there's no demand. And when we speak to people who need recycled plastic, they say there's no supply. So where does the problem lie? Is it quality? Is it business models? Is it regulation? And what would you suggest to bridge that gap?
Making business out of recycled plastic is always a complicated thing because it creates demand for the problem. I've had the curiosity to go to recycling plants and found out that recycled plastics, repat polymers, cost more than virgin plastics in some places because it became trendy to wear a jacket made out of recycled plastic. The problem lies step before, right? To not to reduce so much stuff and to downscale the use of that material to a level that caters for the necessity sectors like healthcare. You still need to use plastics in healthcare. You don't want to avoid that, and then to dematerialize, to back to usable things. So there is also the social dimension. Plastics don't want to promote waste speakers. They don't want to promote informal sectors. You want to formalize those sectors and bring them back from the shadows. That's one of the big arguments of circular economy. You can put more light in the upstream and the downstream as they connect, formalize the sectors. But my take on recycled plastics is that we should look at it with caution, not to create more demand for things made out of this material.
Thank you, Henrique. I think we ran out of time now, and I really appreciate your presence here. Please join me to thank. Thanks also, Leeds, for organizing this seminar. It was really great. Goodbye, you all.